For days, the world was told Richard Smallwood died from kidney failure. But now, gospel icon Kirk Franklin is revealing that it wasn't the full story. Behind the nursing home walls, behind the quiet statements, and behind the prayers, Richard Smallwood was battling far more than his body failing him. What really led to his final days changes how we understand his legacy and why those closest to him are only now speaking out. Stay with me, because this was not just kidney failure. For decades, Richard Smallwood's music did more than fill churches. It carried people through grief, sickness, heartbreak, and moments when faith felt fragile. Songs like Total Praise and I Love the Lord weren't just worship anthems, they became lifelines. So when news broke that Smallwood had passed away quietly in a nursing home on December 30th, 2025, many fans were stunned, not only by the loss, but by how little was said. The initial announcement was brief. A statement from his family confirmed that the Grammy-nominated gospel legend had died from complications related to kidney failure. The words were respectful, careful, and restrained. The family asked for privacy. Tributes poured in. Choirs sang his songs. Churches held moments of silence. And for most people, that seemed to be the end of the story. But behind the scenes, there was another conversation happening, one that wasn't meant for headlines. Because as condolences spread across social media, whispers began circulating among gospel insiders, people who had worked closely with Smallwood, people who had prayed with him, people who had watched his health decline long before the public ever knew. And quietly, a deeper truth started to emerge. Kidney failure was real, but it was not the whole picture. In recent years, Richard Smallwood had been diagnosed with mild dementia, a condition that slowly reshaped his daily life, his independence, and ultimately his final years. Alongside kidney disease, there were additional health complications that required long-term care, leading to his placement in a nursing facility in Sandy Spring, Maryland. This wasn't a sudden collapse. It was a long, private unraveling. And then came the moment that changed everything, when Kirk Franklin, one of gospel music's most influential voices, finally spoke about Richard Smallwood's passing. His words struck a different tone, not sensational, not disrespectful, but revealing. Franklin didn't contradict the official cause of death. Instead, he expanded it. He acknowledged that Smallwood's suffering had layers, and that what the public saw was only the surface of a much heavier reality. That revelation reopened uncomfortable questions. Why were so many details kept quiet? Why did one of gospel music's greatest composers spend his final days largely out of public view? And how does dementia, a condition rarely discussed openly in the Black church, change the way we should understand his final chapter? This video is not about rumor or exploitation. It's about context. It's about honoring a legacy by telling the full truth, even when that truth is uncomfortable. We're going to walk through Richard Smallwood's final years carefully, respectfully, and fact by fact. We'll examine what kidney failure actually does to the body, how dementia alters cognition and independence, and why gospel leaders like Kirk Franklin believe it's time to stop simplifying what really happened. Because when the music fades and the applause ends, what remains is the human story, and Richard Smallwood's final chapter deserves to be understood, not rushed past. But before we get there, we need to rewind back to when the signs first appeared and why almost no one noticed them at the time. Long before Richard Smallwood ever entered a nursing home, there were quiet signs that something in his life was changing, not musically because his genius never faded, but physically and mentally in ways that were easy to miss unless you were close to him. For years, Smallwood continued to appear composed in public. When he showed up at tributes, award ceremonies, or special church moments, he still carried himself with dignity. His speech was deliberate, his presence calm. But behind that polished exterior, his body was already fighting a private battle. Kidney disease is rarely sudden. It's progressive, silent, often misinterpreted as exhaustion, aging, or stress. In Smallwood's case, those closest to him later acknowledged that his health struggles had been unfolding gradually, marked by fatigue, recurring medical appointments, and periods where his energy noticeably dipped. Kidney failure doesn't just affect one organ. As toxins build in the bloodstream, it impacts the brain, the heart, and overall cognition. Patients can experience confusion, memory lapses, difficulty concentrating, and emotional shifts. And for someone like Smallwood, a composer whose life revolved around precision, memory, and emotional nuance, those changes would have been deeply unsettling. Around the same period, people began noticing subtle differences, missed cues, repeated questions, moments where Smallwood seemed withdrawn or unusually quiet. Nothing dramatic, nothing alarming enough to spark rumors, but enough that those who knew him well started to understand this wasn't just physical illness. Eventually, doctors confirmed what many families dread hearing. Richard Smallwood had developed mild dementia. The diagnosis reframed everything. Dementia is not just memory loss. It's a slow erosion of independence. Decision-making becomes harder, familiar routines become confusing, and for public figures, especially within the Black church, where vulnerability is often masked by strength, it's frequently kept private. Smallwood's family chose discretion. They shielded him from speculation. They limited appearances. They focused on care, not headlines. As his kidney condition worsened, managing daily life became increasingly difficult, and full-time medical supervision became necessary. That's how Richard Smallwood ended up in a nursing facility, not because he was abandoned, but because his health required constant attention. Dialysis, medication management, monitoring, cognitive decline. These are realities many families face quietly away from public view. But to fans, the absence felt sudden. One moment his music was everywhere, the next he seemed to disappear. And here's where things get complicated, because when someone is battling both kidney failure and dementia, the cause of death listed on paper often tells only part of the story. Kidney failure may be the final blow, but the deterioration leading up to it is layered, cumulative, and deeply human. This is the part rarely discussed in gospel circles, the part that doesn't fit neatly into tribute posts or memorial concerts, and it's the part that Kirk Franklin would later allude to, not to contradict the truth, but to expand it. Because what Richard Smallwood endured wasn't just an organ shutting down, it was the slow loss of control, the quiet retreat from public life, and a final season marked more by endurance than applause. And yet, the public still didn't know most of this, not until someone close to him finally said what others were afraid to say. In gospel music, death is often framed as victory. Phrases like, "He's resting," "He's with the Lord," and "His work is done" are offered with sincerity and faith. But sometimes those same phrases also become shields, protecting the public from discomfort and protecting families from questions they're not ready to answer. That's why when Kirk Franklin finally addressed Richard Smallwood's passing, his tone stood out. Franklin didn't sensationalize the moment, he didn't contradict the family's statement, but he did something rare in gospel culture. He acknowledged complexity. He spoke about Smallwood's suffering as layered, physical, mental, and emotional, and by doing so, he quietly confirmed what many insiders already knew, but few had publicly said. This was not a simple or sudden passing. Kirk Franklin has long been outspoken about mental health, transparency, and breaking stigmas within the church. From his own public struggles to his advocacy for emotional honesty, he's been one of the few gospel leaders willing to say that faith does not cancel illness, and illness does not equal weakness. So when he referenced the reality of Richard Smallwood's condition beyond kidney failure, it wasn't gossip, it was context. Dementia, in particular, remains a taboo subject in many Black church spaces. It's often misunderstood, minimized, or spiritualized. Symptoms are explained away as aging or tiredness. Families feel pressure to protect reputations, and public figures are quietly removed from visibility rather than openly supported. Richard Smallwood fit that pattern. Instead of public updates, there was silence. Instead of explanations, there was reverence. And while that discretion came from love, it also left fans unprepared for the truth. Many assumed Smallwood had simply chosen a quieter life. Few realized how much he had already lost, cognitively, physically, and socially. Kirk Franklin's words cracked that silence, not by exposing details, but by acknowledging reality. He reminded listeners that greatness does not make someone immune to decline, that musical genius does not shield the brain from disease, and that honoring a legacy sometimes means telling the uncomfortable truth about what that person endured. And here's the part that hit hardest. Franklin hinted that Richard Smallwood's later years were not filled with music and accolades, but with medical routines, assisted care, and moments of confusion that required patience and compassion. That reframing forced fans to reconsider the final image they held of Smallwood, not just as a distant legend, but as a man, aging, vulnerable, and human. The gospel industry's silence suddenly felt louder. Why hadn't more leaders spoken up about supporting aging artists? Why aren't conversations about dementia, caregiving, and long-term illness more common in faith spaces? And how many other gospel legends are quietly struggling right now? By saying what he did, Kirk Franklin didn't just honor Richard